The last thing Liam had built was the coffin for their stillborn daughter. The second to last thing he had built was their cabin. In the months that followed, Ilara could not decide which was colder. Both were made of pine, sealed against the world, and held a profound and hollow emptiness. Both were monuments to a future that would never arrive. Liam himself was gone now, taken by a falling widowmaker in the woods 2 months after they had buried the child. He left behind a half-filled woodpile, a notice of debt from the land office, and the cabin, which was failing. It was a handsome cabin, by the standards of the territory. Liam had been a good carpenter, but he had followed the plans of Mr. Alistair Thorne, the man who had designed every structure in the valley. Thorne was a man of modern sensibilities. He believed in milled lumber, iron stoves, and the swiftness of new American ways. The old ways, he often said, were for old countries. Here, they built for the future, not the past. Thorne's cabins were all identical twins of progress. Single walls of lodgepole pine, squared and notched with precision. The gaps were chinked with a mixture of mud, sand, and dried moss. A black iron stove, shipped all the way from a foundry in Ohio, sat in the center of the single room, its thin stovepipe rising through the roof like a defiant finger pointed at the sky. They were built quickly, and they looked sturdy, but the wind on the high plains did not care for appearances. It was only October, yet the wind had already begun its winter work. It was a living thing, a predator that searched for weakness. It found it in the chinking between Liam's well-hewn logs. The mixture, dried too quickly in the arid air, had shrunk and cracked, creating 1,000 tiny mouths that whistled and sighed, spitting drafts of icy air into the room. Ilara spent her days stuffing these cracks with anything she could find. Rags, more moss, pages torn from the back of a book of Psalms. But it was like trying to patch a sieve with tears. For every crack she filled, the wind, with its patient, malicious intelligence, would find another. The cold did not just enter the cabin, it seeped into the very wood itself. The walls felt like slabs of ice to the touch. The stove, for all its modern efficiency, was a voracious beast. It demanded a constant tribute of split pine, and in return, it offered a small, shimmering circle of warmth that extended no more than 5 feet from its iron belly. Beyond that circle, the cold ruled. She was an outsider, a condition made more acute by widowhood. Her people were not from Ohio or Pennsylvania. They were from the Isles, a place of stone and sea and a different, damper kind of cold. She had her grandmother's eyes and her grandmother's silence, traits that the bustling, forthright women of the valley mistook for weakness. They brought her casseroles and condolences, their pity as thin and sharp as the autumn wind. They saw a frail girl, alone, with a cabin that bled heat and a woodpile that was shrinking with alarming speed. They saw a tragedy in the making. The valley elders, Mr. Thorne among them, had come to see her a week after Liam's funeral. They sat in her cold cabin, their hands wrapped around mugs of weak tea she could ill afford to spare. Thorne, a man whose confidence was as solid and square as the houses he designed, ran a hand over the wall. He felt the chill. "A new cabin always takes a season to settle," he pronounced, his voice filling the small space. "The logs shrink. It is the nature of green wood." "The chinking is cracking," Ilara said, her voice quiet but clear. "The wind comes through. The stove cannot keep up." Thorne gave a patronizing smile. "The stove is the finest model available, burns hot and clean. You must feed it, Mistress Hale. A fire demands respect." He was implying she was stingy with the wood, that this was a failure of housekeeping, not of construction. "I feed it all day," she replied, her gaze steady, "and all day the warmth is stolen by the walls." A younger man, one of the land agents, snorted. "It is a fine cabin, Better than the sod houses some folks are still living in. Thorne stood, placing his mug on the table with a definitive click. He looked at Alara, his eyes holding a mixture of impatience and pity. Your husband, may he rest in peace, was a fine builder. He followed my design to the letter. There is no fault in the house. Perhaps the fault is in the melancholic humors of a grieving woman. He did not say it unkindly, but the words were a wall, impenetrable. He was dismissing her, her concerns, her reality. He was sealing her fate. The cabin is sound, he concluded, speaking to the other men as much as to her. It will see her through the winter, provided she has the good sense to keep the stove fed. They left, and with their departure, Alara understood she had been formally condemned. They had looked at her situation, applied their conventional wisdom, and found her wanting. They would offer no help. The failure of the cabin would be her failure, not theirs. She was alone with the whistling walls and the coming ice. That night, the temperature dropped further. The water in the bucket by the door had a skin of ice on it by morning. Alara lay awake, listening to the wind, feeling its cold breath on her face, even as she huddled under every blanket she owned. She thought of her grandmother, a woman who had lived on an island where the wind blew so hard it could peel the fleece from a sheep. Her grandmother had never been cold a day in her life, she used to say. Her house, a low, thick-walled thing of stone and turf, had held the warmth of a summer afternoon, even in the teeth of a January gale. Desperation is a key. It unlocks rooms in the mind that have long been sealed. Alara rose from her bed, the cold floorboards shocking her bare feet, and went to the small, sea-worn trunk that had accompanied her grandmother across the ocean. It held linens, a few pieces of silver, and a heavy, leather-bound journal. She had never looked through it. Her grandmother's language, a lyrical and guttural Gaelic, was a mystery to her. But her grandmother had been a practical woman. She had known her granddaughters would be born into an English-speaking world. Alara lifted the heavy book. The leather was cracked and smelled of salt and peat. She opened it. The first pages were filled with the unfamiliar script, but as she turned them, sketches began to appear. They were drawn with a confident, steady hand. There were drawings of knots, of herbs, of the phases of the moon. And then she found it, a series of detailed drawings of a house. It was not a handsome house like the ones Thorne designed. It was low and rounded like a loaf of bread. But the drawings were not of its appearance. They were of its anatomy. Her grandmother had drawn cross-sections, peeling back the layers to show how it was made. It was a house with two skins. There was an inner wall and then an outer wall, built of flat, stacked stones. Between the two, a space, a gap. In the margins, in a cramped but clear English hand, her grandmother had written notes. "The wind is a thief," one note read. "Do not let it touch your true walls. Give it a false wall to spend its fury on." Another note was next to a drawing of the sun. "The stone drinks the sun's light. It holds the warmth like a cup. At night, it shares what it has saved." And a third, underlined twice, "Still air is the best blanket of all. A pocket of air that cannot move is a shield against the fist of the cold." Alara stared at the drawings, at the simple, profound words. It was not magic. It was physics. The outer stone wall would act as a windbreak and a thermal mass, absorbing solar energy during the day. The air gap would act as insulation, preventing the cold that saturated the stone from being conducted to the inner wooden walls of the cabin. Her cabin would be a house inside a house. The cold would lay siege to the outer fortress, but it would never reach the keep. She looked from the journal to the cold, weeping walls of her cabin. She looked at her small hands, calloused from farm work, but not from quarrying. She looked out the window at the land around her cabin. It was not good farmland. It was littered with stones, the refuse of ancient glaciers, ranging from the size of a fist to the size of a small sheep. The farmers cursed them. They called the area a stone pasture. But Alara saw not a curse, but a quarry, an arsenal. She began that very day. The first task was to dig a foundation for the stone wall. She needed a shallow trench, a footing to keep the base of the wall from shifting. She took Liam's spade and a pickaxe and measured out a line, 2 feet from the cabin walls, all the way around. The ground was already hard with the coming frost. The pickaxe rang against it with a dull thud. Each swing sent a jarring shock up her arms and into her shoulders. By noon, she had managed to break only a few feet of sod. Her hands were raw, the blisters already forming. The wind was relentless, pulling at her dress, whipping strands of hair across her face, stealing the warmth generated by the hard labor. She stopped, not to rest, but to change her strategy. She went to the woodpile and brought back a bucket of hot embers from the stove. She spread them along the line she had marked, letting the heat begin her work for her. The ground thawed, softened, and the digging became possible. It was a lesson from the book of the earth, not the book of men. The work was a brutal rhythm. Dig, heave, clear. Her world shrank to the trench, the bite of the shovel, the ache in her lower back. She worked until the sun began to dip below the horizon, its light turning pale and thin. That evening, she did not have the energy to cook. She ate a piece of bread, her hands trembling with exhaustion, and fell into a sleep so deep it was like a small death. Section. The next morning, every muscle screamed in protest. To rise from bed was an act of war against her own body. But the memory of her grandmother's words, the logic of the drawings, was a fire in her mind. She forced herself up, dressed in Liam's old trousers and a flannel shirt, and went back to the trench. While she dug, she planned. She needed to move the stones. Liam had built a small, sturdy sled for hauling firewood. It would have to do. The stones in the pasture were a mix of granite and schist, smoothed by time and ice. They were heavy, dense with the cold of the earth. Her first attempt to move a large, flat-topped boulder was a failure. It would not budge. She was strong, but she was not a man, and this was a man's work. Or so the world had told her. Her grandmother's journal had a sketch for this, too. A simple lever, a long, sturdy pole of cured oak, a smaller rock for a fulcrum. Alara found a fallen branch, thick as her thigh, and a suitable fulcrum stone. She wedged the end of the lever under the boulder, placed the fulcrum, and threw her entire weight onto the other end. The great stone groaned, shifted, and then lifted, just enough for her to slide rollers, smaller, rounded logs, underneath. With agonizing slowness, she was able to wrestle it onto the sled. It had taken her an hour to move one stone. She looked at the cabin. She looked at the vast, stone-strewn field. The scale of the task was immense, overwhelming. It was a task for a team of oxen and a crew of strong men, not one grieving widow. Doubt, cold and sharp as the wind, pierced her resolve. This was folly. She sat on the cold ground, the wind drying the sweat on her brow, and she nearly wept. But then she looked at the single stone sitting on the sled. It was a start. Her grandmother had not built her house in a day. She had built it over a summer, stone by patient stone. The ocean did not wear down the cliff with a single blow, but with a billion patient waves. One stone at a time, she whispered to the wind. She would not think about the whole wall. She would think only of the next stone, and then the next. The days fell into a grueling pattern. Wake before dawn, stoke the fire, eat, dig the foundation, haul stones. The sun would rise, offering little warmth, and she would work. Her hands, once soft, became a landscape of calluses, blisters, and cuts. Her muscles, at first protesting with fire, hardened into a wiry strength she had never known she possessed. She learned the language of the stones. She learned which ones were flat and stable, good for the base. She learned which ones were angular, useful for filling gaps. She learned how to read their weight and balance before she even tried to lift them. Her project did not go unnoticed. A neighbor, riding the fence line, saw her wrestling a large stone onto the sled and stopped, his mouth agape. "What in God's name are you doing, Mistress Hale?" he called out. "Improving my home," she said, not pausing in her work. The man shook his head and rode on. The story spread through the valley. The widow Hale had gone mad with grief. She was building a wall around her cabin, a prison, a tomb. The name was born in the general store, over a game of checkers. The Widow's Folly. It was spoken with a mixture of pity and cruel amusement. Alistair Thorne heard the rumors and decided to see for himself. He rode out on his fine bay horse, reining in at the edge of her property. He watched for a long time as Alara, grimy and sweating despite the cold, maneuvered a stone into place in the first course of her wall. She was dry stacking them, fitting them together with an uncanny precision, using smaller stones as shims to keep the structure tight. She was careful to maintain the 2-foot gap between her new wall and the cabin's logs. He dismounted and approached, his boots making crunching sounds on the frosty ground. "Mistress Hale," he said, his voice laced with authority. Alara looked up, wiping a stray strand of hair from her face with the back of a dirty glove. She did not stop her work. "You are engaged in a great deal of effort," he began, gesturing at the low wall. "A fool's effort, if I may be so bold." "You may not," she said flatly. Thorne was taken aback by her tone, but pressed on. "Stone is a conductor of cold. Any stonemason knows this. You are building a wall of ice around your home. It will draw every last bit of warmth out. You are making your problem 100 times worse." He was explaining a basic principle of his craft, as if to a child. He was certain of his knowledge. "The stone will not touch the house," she said, fitting a small shim into a gap. "There will be a blanket of air between them." Thorne laughed, a short, sharp bark of a laugh. "A blanket of air? My dear woman, air is nothing. The cold will pass right through it. You are wasting your strength in what little time you have before the first snows. I urge you, for your own sake, stop this madness. Spend your time chopping wood. That is the only thing that will save you." "I have heard your counsel, Mr. Thorne," Alara said, turning her back to him to select another stone. "I have chosen to follow another's." His face hardened. Her defiance, her rejection of his expertise, was an insult. "So be it," he said, his voice cold. "Do not come to us when you are freezing in the tomb of your own making. We all warned you." He mounted his horse and rode away, the very picture of offended authority. The encounter, meant to chasten her, only hardened her resolve. His certainty was a brittle thing, built on a single, incomplete idea. He saw the stone. He did not see the space between. He saw the material. He did not see the design. The wall grew, inch by painstaking inch. It rose past her knees, then to her waist. She built a ramp of earth to help her get the heavier stones to the higher levels. She was a solitary, relentless engine of labor. Agnes, an older widow who lived down the road, began leaving a small pail of milk and a loaf of bread on her porch every few days. She never spoke of the wall. The offering was a silent testament of support, a small act of faith in a valley of doubters. It was a kindness that fueled Alara as much as the food itself. She worked with a focused intensity that bordered on obsession. She was racing the winter. The sky was a constant, ominous slate gray. The birds had long since fled south. The squirrels had vanished into their nests. The world was holding its breath. Alara worked on. Lay the stone, find the fit, shim it tight, maintain the gap. The rhythm was a prayer, a meditation, a declaration of war against the cold. She finished the last course of stone, reaching the eaves of the cabin on the day the first snowflakes began to fall. They were small and hesitant at first, then larger, thicker, coming down with a silent, inexorable purpose. The wall was done. It was not beautiful. It was a rough, cyclopean thing, a patchwork of gray and brown and lichen-spotted granite. It looked ancient, primal. It looked like it had grown from the earth itself. Alara went inside her cabin. The air was already different. The 1,000 whistling mouths in the chinking had been silenced. The wind still raged outside. She could hear its low moan as it battered the stone, but it could no longer be felt. The drafts were gone. The air inside was still. Utterly, profoundly still. She placed a single small log in the stove. The fire caught, and a gentle warmth began to radiate into the room. Before, that warmth would have been immediately sucked away by the cold logs. Now, it stayed. The inner walls, protected by the air gap and the stone fortress, were no longer bleeding heat. They were slowly, almost imperceptibly, beginning to warm to the ambient temperature of the room. She had done it. Her grandmother's wisdom had been true. The snow fell for 2 days, blanketing the valley in a thick layer of white. It was a normal first snow, a gentle harbinger of the season. The valley residents settled in, confident in their sturdy cabins and their large woodpiles. They spoke of the widow's folly, now buried under the snow, and shook their heads. Then came the change. The wind shifted, coming down from the north like a physical blow. The temperature plummeted. The old-timers called it a blue norther, a storm that came from the Arctic itself, a river of pure cold. But this was no ordinary storm. The newspapers, weeks later, would call it the Great White Hurricane of 1888. It was a blizzard of historic, terrifying proportions. The wind screamed, a constant, high-pitched shriek that clawed at the roofs and walls of the cabins. It was not a sound, but a pressure, a physical force that seemed to want to dismantle the world. The snow did not fall. It flew horizontally, a blinding, scouring torrent of white that reduced visibility to zero. It was finer than sand, and the wind drove it into every crack, every seam, every imperfection. Inside the standard Thorne-designed cabins, the situation quickly became desperate. The wind forced the fine, sharp snow right through the failed chinking. Little piles of white powder began to form on the floors along the walls. The drafts were no longer subtle annoyances. They were jets of Arctic air that cut like knives. The iron stoves became insatiable gods. The men worked in shifts, constantly feeding them wood. The hungry roar of the draft was a constant reminder of the battle being waged. But it was a losing battle. The stoves could heat the air, but they could not heat the walls. The logs of the cabins, directly exposed to the shrieking, sub-zero wind, were becoming reservoirs of cold. Frost began to form on the inside of the walls, a crystalline tracery of failure. People huddled closer and closer to their stoves, wrapped in every blanket they owned, their world shrinking to a tiny, precarious island of warmth in a sea of deadly cold. Alistair Thorne's house was no different. It was his personal showcase, built with the best wood and the most meticulous care. But his design was flawed, and the storm was exposing that flaw without mercy. He had already burned through a quarter of his winter wood supply in a single day. The temperature in the room, even with the stove glowing a faint red, was dropping. His wife was trying to keep their two small children warm, her face etched with fear. "More wood, Alistair," she said, her voice trembling. He looked at the wood box. It was nearly empty. He would have to go out to the woodpile, to brave that white hell for another armload. He thought of Alara Hale. A grim, morbid satisfaction settled in his gut. Her folly, her wall of cold stone, would have been her end. She had a small woodpile to begin with. She was almost certainly dead already, a frozen statue in her ridiculous tomb. The thought was a small, ugly comfort in his own growing fear. He fought his way to the woodpile and back, the journey of 30 feet taking him nearly 10 minutes. The wind tore the breath from his lungs, and the snow blinded him. When he stumbled back inside, covered in white, he saw the frost had now climbed halfway up the walls. His children were crying, their breath pluming in the air. They burned through that wood, and then the next armload. They broke up a spare chair and fed it to the flames. The house was losing. The cold was winning. Desperation gnawed at him. He thought of Alara again. What if he was wrong? The thought was a heresy, a crack in the foundation of his own identity. But his children's shivering was a more powerful force than his pride. There was another thought, a darker one. If she had perished, her cabin might still have some wood left. It was a monstrous thought, but survival was a monstrous business. He had to know. "I'm going out," he told his wife. "No! You'll die out there!" she cried. "I'm going to the Hale place," he said, his voice grim. "Stay here. Don't let the fire go out." He wrapped a thick wool scarf around his face, pulled his hat down low, and plunged into the storm. It was like stepping into another world. The force of the wind knocked him sideways. He could not see his own feet. He navigated by memory, by the faint outline of a fence line he knew was there. Every breath was painful, the air so cold it felt like swallowing glass. His beard and eyebrows froze instantly. The journey, normally a 5-minute walk, took him almost half an hour. He stumbled, fell, and crawled, driven by a desperate, terrifying curiosity. He was convinced he was on a fool's errand, a march towards a frozen corpse. He almost missed the cabin entirely, a low, snow-covered mound in the white chaos. He saw the rough shape of the stone wall first. The snow had drifted up against it, creating a smooth, aerodynamic rampart. The wind, hitting this curve, seemed to flow over the house rather than battering it. There was an uncanny quiet in the lee of the wall. He looked for the chimney. There was no smoke. His heart sank. He had been right. She was gone. He felt a pang of guilt, sharp and unwelcome. He had mocked her. He had condemned her. He pushed the feeling away and staggered towards the cabin door, expecting it to be drifted shut. But as he drew closer, he felt something impossible. Warmth. It was not a blast of heat. It was a gentle, radiant warmth. He put a bare hand out and touched the surface of the stacked stones. They were not warm, not like a stove, but they were not cold. They were not coated in frost. They felt neutral, like a stone on a cool summer evening. The deadly, biting chill of the air was absent from their surface. The stones, the great, stupid folly, were holding back the winter. Stunned, disoriented, he reached the door. It was clear of snow. He pounded on it with a frozen fist, the sound shockingly loud in the relative quiet behind the wall. For a long moment, there was no answer. Then, he heard the sound of a latch being drawn. The door swung open. Alara stood there. She was not wrapped in blankets. She was wearing a simple wool dress. Her hair was neatly pinned. Behind her, the The cabin was bathed in the soft, steady light of an oil lamp. A wave of warmth washed over him, so profound and shocking it made him dizzy. It was not the scorching, dry heat of an overtaxed stove, but a gentle, pervasive comfort. The air was still and calm. He saw her stove in the corner. A small, contented fire flickered behind the grate, the stovepipe emitting only the faintest whisper of a draft. She was burning a single, small log, as if it were a mild autumn evening. He stared, speechless. He looked at the inner walls of her cabin. They were bare wood with no trace of frost. He could see the faint grain of the pine. She had a piece of mending in her lap on a chair. A book lay open on the table. She was not just surviving, she was living. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice even, "you are letting the cold in." The simple statement shattered the last remnants of his pride. He stumbled across the threshold, bringing a swirl of snow and frigid air with him. He could not speak. He could only stare at the impossible reality of the room. He saw the truth in a single blinding flash. The outer wall took the punishment of the wind. The air gap, that blanket of nothing, stopped the cold from passing through. The stone, having absorbed the faint heat of the previous day's sun, was now a massive thermal battery, slowly, imperceptibly, releasing that stored energy inward, fighting the cold from the outside. And the inner cabin, protected from the assault, only had to be heated against its own minimal loss. A small fire was all it took. It was a perfect system. Simple. Elegant. And he had called it folly. "My family," he finally managed to stammer, his words thick, his jaw stiff with cold. "My children. We are freezing. Our wood is almost gone." Alara looked at him. There was no triumph in her eyes, no "I told you so." There was only a quiet, deep-seeing calm. She nodded. "Bring them here," she said. Thorne did not need to be told twice. The journey back to his own house was fueled by a new, desperate hope. He burst into his freezing cabin like a man possessed. "We're leaving! Get the children ready! We're going to the Hale place!" His wife looked at him as if he were mad, but the certainty in his voice was absolute. They wrapped the children in every remaining blanket, and Thorne led them out into the storm, a human chain of desperation. He followed his own tracks back to the snow-covered mound that was a haven. When Alara opened the door to them, Thorne's wife gasped. The warmth, the calm, the sheer normality of it was a physical shock. Alara took the shivering children from their arms and sat them on a rug near the gentle stove, giving them warm milk from a pot. They were not the last to arrive. An hour later, a pounding at the door revealed the neighbor who had first mocked her, his own family in tow. Then Agnes, the kind widow, appeared, her own small cabin having finally succumbed. Alara's folly, the house built for one, became a sanctuary for 9. They huddled together in the small space, a pocket of life in the heart of the white hurricane. Thorne sat on a low stool, watching his children sleep peacefully, their cheeks flushed with warmth. He watched Alara move about the small space, calm and efficient, sharing her meager supplies of bread and cheese. He was a master builder, a man of reputation and importance. He had built a dozen houses in this valley, all of them based on the best modern principles, and they had all failed. This young woman, this silent widow with her grandmother's book and her unyielding resolve, had built a structure that had succeeded. He finally looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not a foolish girl, but a sage. "How?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Alara did not speak. She went to the sea chest and took out the leather journal. She opened it to the pages with the drawings, the cross-sections of the walls, the notes in English. She handed it to him. He took it with trembling hands. He saw the elegant simplicity of the design he had been too blind, too arrogant to understand. The false wall for the wind, the stone cup for the sun, the blanket of still air. It was all there. A wisdom so old it had become new again. "I built houses," he said, his voice thick with shame and awe. "You built a home." The blizzard raged for 2 more days. In the warm, quiet space of Ilara's cabin, a community was forged. The storm that was tearing the world apart was binding them together. When the wind finally died and a weak, watery sun appeared, the world was transformed. It was a landscape of immense, silent drifts, of buried fences and entombed barns. The story of the survivors in the widow's folly spread as quickly as the thaw. People came on snowshoes, their faces grim, expecting to find the worst, only to find the small cabin and its stone shell intact, a plume of smoke curling lazily from its chimney. They saw Thorn and his family emerge, safe and warm. They saw Ilara standing in her doorway, no longer the pitiable widow, but something else entirely. Her status was transformed overnight. The bank agent, whose own family had spent 2 days shivering in their failing house, tore up the notice of debt on her land. The men who had laughed at her now looked at her with a new, profound respect. The women who had pitied her now sought her counsel. She had faced the worst the world could throw at her, and she had not only survived, she had triumphed, and she had saved others in the process. In the spring, when the great melt began, a delegation came to her cabin. It was led by Alistair Thorn. He was a changed man, quieter, more humble. His arrogance had been scoured away by the blizzard. "Mistress Hale," he began, holding his hat in his hands, "we were wrong. We were fools, blinded by our own pride. What you have built, it is the future of this valley. Will you teach us?" Ilara looked at the faces of the men before her. They were the same men who had dismissed her, mocked her, but their faces held no trace of their old certainty. They were humbled, ready to learn. She nodded. And so, she taught them. She brought out her grandmother's journal and explained the principles. She did not teach them to build houses that looked like hers. She taught them the idea behind it, the stone skin, the thermal mass, the air gap. That summer, the valley was filled with the sound of stone being moved and stacked. They began retrofitting the existing cabins. Under Ilara's guidance, and with Thorn as her most diligent student, they built stone walls around their flawed wooden homes. They learned to read the stones, to build without mortar, to respect the power of still air. The next winter came, and it was a cold one. But it was not a fearful one. The houses of the valley were warm. Wood piles lasted twice as long. The children were safe. The whistling of the wind in the walls was a memory. Ilara's folly became the template. The technique, refined and adapted, spread to the neighboring valleys, becoming known as the Hale method. Houses were no longer just shelters from the storm. They were partners with the environment, capturing the sun, deflecting the wind, hoarding the warmth. Ilara lived a long and quiet life. She never remarried. She did not need to. Her cabin, her home, was her legacy. Travelers passing through the region would remark on the unique architecture, the cozy, stone-wrapped houses that seemed to grow from the landscape itself. And the old-timers would tell them the story of the young widow who, in the face of a terrible winter and the scorn of all the experts, had listened to the wisdom of her grandmother and built a wall of stone, creating a fortress of warmth that the cold could never touch again. They called her the Stone Mother of the Valley, the woman who had taught them how to truly come home.